Welcome, everybody. Introduction to Leading Beyond Ego, our nine-week online course that explores what we believe is the leadership capacity that both precedes and facilitates all others. I'm Steve Matenko. I want to introduce you to my two partners, co-creators of Leading Beyond Ego, both of whom you'll hear from a lot in this hour. Barbara Hunt.
Hi, everyone. Hi, welcome.
And Rod Duick.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be with you.
At the end of the call today, we'll offer you an overview of this 9-week course, but what we're committed really to offering you in this hour is not just information, but value. So we'll lead you through a couple of exercises to give you a sense of what the course is like, and we'll also give you a couple of practices that you can take away and apply to your own leadership situation immediately, practices that we believe can make a significant difference in your leadership effectiveness, even after just this small experience with what we're calling Beyond Ego leadership. And by the end of the hour, we hope to leave you intrigued with the possibilities of a Beyond Ego workplace. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the hour, but at any time, feel free to click on the chat icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. That'll open up another window on the bottom right. It says something like type message here. You get a question or a comment. Be more than happy to consider it. So that you can go ahead and do that at any time during the hour. Oh, and by the way, nobody can see your chat window submissions, the question or comment you type in, except for the three of us co-hosts. Again, my name is Steve Matenko. I have been coaching leaders individually and in groups for about 17 years. It's the most gratifying work I have ever done. And by the way, a leader for the purposes of this course is not someone who has a particular position in a hierarchy, but rather someone who has any influence on any other human being, and that would be you. I've trained managers at Boeing and at Microsoft, as well as through the nonprofit Center for Ethical Leadership in Seattle. And a leadership program that I've helped to create is now the standard throughout the global operations of a Fortune 500 company. But about 3.5 years ago, it occurred to me that there's a higher calling for me. And that is a calling to merge my own personal growth path with my career. And at that moment was born this notion of leading beyond ego. It's born from the radical idea that work would be incredibly more satisfying, more fulfilling, and also more successful if we could all take the voices of our ego, which we can't eradicate, but if we could all put them in the passenger seat, if we could agree to do that, and we believe it's possible to do that, then the experience of work could totally transform. This is the radical idea that we will dive into in this hour and throughout the 9 weeks of our course. We've had a number of collaborators along the way, but the two people that will be talking to you on this call with me have been with this effort for the 3.5 years since the seed started to germinate. And it's been a wonderfully collaborative effort. I can't tell you how fulfilling it is to work with a team of people who literally is successful taking their egos and putting them in the passenger seat. Not that our egos don't show up inside of us, but we've been pretty good, in my assessment, at not letting them get in the way. So let you meet them, starting with Barbara Hunt.
Hi, everyone. I was just going to let you know a little bit about myself as well in relation to my interest in this particular program, because like Steve, it feels like a culmination of my life's work. So for the past 25 years, I've been a mentor and a coach as well. And I facilitate deep change work, which means I specialize in doing emotional work with people in all kinds of fields. And my first degree was in education and child psychology. And ever since then, I've just been fascinated by human potential, by the tools and perspectives that really serve us in living our lives, and also in becoming more conscious as human beings. So that overlap between the personal and the spiritual development. And currently 10 times a year, I work with a group of other people who run a retreat in the UK. And our speciality is doing a detox for the mind, the body, and the spirit. And so it's a combination of physical and mental and emotional well-being. And I've also led workshops myself, including, and most recently, I've written a book called Forgiveness Made Easy, and I specialize in helping people to get to forgiveness. And actually, as part of leadership work, it's really important that we learn how to manage our relationships with each other, and forgiveness can be a really essential part of that. And so, although my specialty is in transformational change, always, whenever I'm working with individuals and people who are in positions of leadership, it always comes down to you as an individual leader and what it is that you need to evolve beyond and evolve into. And that's what's wonderful about this particular program, is we're putting all of our experience in the world of coaching and supporting leaders into this context of evolving and meeting the challenges of our time. And so this is a really brilliant opportunity for us to offer what we've experienced as well, learning to co-create together. So we're actually going to be talking about how we've created this course as a collaborative venture too. So I'm going to hand you over to Rod.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rodney Dueck, and although I was born on a family farm and later grew up in a small town hardware store in southern Minnesota, I come to you today as a retired physician who's fascinated by the qualities of purpose and possibility that flow from beyond ego awareness. I started my medical practice with no interest whatsoever in leadership, and yet, ironically, looking back, I spent at least half of my time in leadership roles. And so by way of introduction, I'd like to tell you a bit about how that happened. My first job was a 3-year commitment to work in a relatively small hospital and clinic in an underserved area of Appalachia. Among the first things I noticed was all the fighting. The doctors were undermining each other, even suing each other. Nurses were in a war of attrition with control-oriented administrators. And as those 3 years passed, I noticed how easy it was to get stuck, really get sucked into the turmoil, and how it seemed to be bad for care. I couldn't prove it, but it was certainly my intuitive sense. And so in the process of trying to figure out what to do, I came across an interesting research study of critical care units in the British Healthcare Service. And they did something that I thought was really ingenious. They sent out a collection of detailed questionnaires to doctors, nurses, and managers, asking them, how are you getting along? How are you getting along with each other? And then they looked at the quality of care for these patients. They identified 3 groups and some rather amazing results. The first basically said, yeah, we're getting along well. There wasn't great enthusiasm and there wasn't great negativity. They were just kind of steady as she goes. And it turned out that I think it was average, typical for the entire system, that these various systems function. Then the second group was fighting all the time. That's what they reported. And when something went wrong, they tended to withdraw into themselves as smaller groups. There was tendency to blame, finger point, and really look to others to solve the problem, really the perspectives of ego. And then when they looked at the care there, 40 to 60%, the death rate was that much higher than the average for the system. And then finally, the third group was saying we really get along well. When something bad happens, we're drawn together. We try to understand what happened, what we can do. There was, what should I say, no finger pointing, no blaming, just focusing on the most essential problem and doing what was necessary. And I think this group had a death rate that was 49 to 50% on average below the average for the system. So even when life is at stake, these were the kinds of results that functional or dysfunctional relationship could produce. And so this struck me as, if you will, a slow motion bolt of lightning, in the sense that it took me longer than it should have to understand what was required of me. And I think gradually I realized that I was part of a culture and a system of care, and that if if that system of care was even sicker than the patients it was seeing, that I was responsible to work on that too, whether I liked it or not. Eventually I realized that it was not just my responsibility, it was really a necessity. And that's when my interest in leadership began. After 3 additional years of specialty training, I joined a much larger medical center. Interestingly, I found some of the same problems there, except that it was a much healthier culture with a serious commitment to quality care as a first priority. And so it was much easier to handle and address problems of that sort. So I spent the last 25 years of my career getting deeper and deeper into what healthy cultures, systems, and people and authentic collaboration can accomplish. And I really come to this course with enthusiasm about what can be accomplished. Earlier, Steve spoke a bit about how and why our system, our course got established. When we began, we did, as Steve suggested, we really delved into the question, would it be possible? What if people were more ego aware, and as leaders, their motivations were sourced from something beyond their egos? And we did this because we all knew that there were massive, urgent problems facing humanity on a global and community and even personal scales. And so we asked an additional question, which was, what's going on in the world that would be in harmony with the sentiments that I've just expressed? And we found it everywhere. We found it in the wisdom traditions, East and West, taught by people we know like Craig Hamilton, Jeff Carrera, Thomas Hubel, Ken Wilber. There's a huge amount of academic research on human development and the evolution of consciousness. There's extensive research in psychology and neuroscience, and in the work of leading edge business consultants like Frederick Laloux, or executive coaches like Rob McNamara. This perspective is evident, and also in major teaching programs such as Peter Senge's Organizational Learning Center or Otto Scharmer's Presencing Institute at MIT. That plus an explosion of books on the topic really inspired us to get involved with this more deeply. And in the process, we've learned that translating this knowledge and wisdom into daily work now seems to be a huge barrier. And I would say that is a large part of our current motivation. So now, to continue this exploration, Steve will speak a bit about how ego and beyond ego can show up in typical leadership situations.
I'd like to invite you along with me on a little thought experiment, kind of a ride of imagination. Let's imagine that you're preparing a presentation for senior leaders at work, or maybe for your biggest client, something that is appropriate to your situation. Now, I bet as you both prepare and deliver this presentation, you'll be able to identify 2 different motivations inside you. They'll both energize you to do a good job, but for different reasons and potentially with different results. How you show up both in the preparation stage and in the presentation of this presentation could be dramatically different depending on which motivation you choose to ride. So the first motivation is one we're all familiar with, the egoic motivation. We all have it. It's universal. It's human nature. As much as we might be embarrassed to admit it, it's going to be there. You want to impress your boss's boss, maybe other senior leaders in the room. You want them to know how smart you are, how hardworking you are, how clever your PowerPoint design skills are, for example. And then maybe you'll be promoted so you can advance your career and support your family. This motivation, again, it's alive inside all of us. We're not going to get rid of it. We might as well acknowledge that it's there. Everybody wants to be appreciated and respected, and for good reasons, reasons that it's easy to trace back to our survival instinct, our need to belong. But because this motivation is essentially survival oriented, it's also essentially self-protective and thus fear-based. So as you're preparing this presentation, you're aware of this voice, if you can tune into it, this voice that wants to impress everyone, dazzle them with your brilliance. But maybe you're also aware of another voice inside you. And it might be a subtler voice, but it's a voice with another set of motivations that are set in a larger context. This is what we're calling the beyond ego motivation. Now, this motivation is about the greater good that can come from the, let's say, the project that your presentation is advocating for. What benefits will this project create for your team, for your organization, for your customers, for everyone that has an interest in your work, maybe for your community? And both these sets of motivations will send me into the presentation well prepared, energetic, and as persuasive as I can be. But if I'm focusing my attention on this, what we're calling beyond ego motivation, I'll show up differently. I'm not going to care so much what everyone thinks of me, because it's not about me. It's about the potential of the project, which now I am just proxy for. So as a result, I'm less likely to be nervous, although the egoic voice is still there and maybe driving some nervousness. But the metric of success that I'm paying attention to now is not about how everyone appreciates me. It's about the project. And the irony ultimately is that I'm more likely to be personally successful if I'm not focused on my own personal success, because now I'm going to earn the reputation of someone who's more about service and contribution than about self. So this is just a really tiny illustration of the essence of beyond ego leadership, the focus in every moment on what's possible in a larger context of service and contribution without necessarily denying your own needs. So Barbara now will flesh out from this little illustration these concepts as we're defining them of ego and beyond ego.
Yeah, so you already probably have a sense of what we mean by ego, because that's what drew you to come to the call. And we say on our website that the human ego is not equipped for the challenges of our time, that in fact, ego is the challenge. And it's precisely really this, and what Steve's laying out here, is that we always have a choice between these two motivational states. But most of the time, we might not be noticing that we have this choice. And the ego, we don't really mean the psychotherapeutic sense of ego. That's not the definition we're using. We're using it much more in a street sense, and meaning that the ego is the part of us that's our self-image, that puts us above, below, or against others. And it's the interior landscape of you. It's who you think you are, but it's who you think you need to defend and how you have to justify your behavior in order to show up in a particular way. And most of this behavior is, of course, unconscious, and it's based on our patterns of our learning when we were much younger. And we'll get obviously much more into that in the course about what, you know, who you think you are and why it's in the way. But you just want to get a sense now that really the ego is a limiter. It stops us from being able to communicate with other people in a way that's authentic. It stops us from seeing that there are potentials there for collaborating, and always when we get to be pitched against other people, when we find ourselves in conflict, that's always because there's an ego. Because if it's just something that's where there's a possibility for something greater to emerge in the conflict where you can resolve it, then you're going to be moving into the beyond ego state. And so just to finish about the ego, this part of us is resistant to change, and it fears change. It wants everything to be the same. It wants comfort and it wants control. And it's all about our self-definition and certainly who we think we are, particularly in relation with others. And it also show up in our beliefs and our expectations, in our preferences, and in our it's based on our survival instincts, and so it can feel very strong. It can feel almost like our life is at stake, when actually it's just either our reputation or who we think we are. And And so in workplace conflict, this can be a real big problem. And so what we're talking about in this course is really a way of making a shift. So first of all, you have to become very familiar with the territory of the ego and understand how does it show up in you, and to be able to spot it in others as well. And then to make this shift out of the ego. And I like to think of it a bit like in a stick shift car, moving the stick shift from a gear, so it can either be in reverse or in first gear, into neutral, so that you're into a state where you're not really attached to a particular behavior. You're open, you're curious, you're able to see a bigger perspective, because you're not attached to a particular outcome. It doesn't mean that you don't have a vision. It just means that you're not stuck necessarily needing things to be a particular way in order to make you look good or to satisfy your ego by being right. And so this beyond ego perspective is a wider perspective. It takes more points of view into the picture, and it can help to be more. It's a state that is present and available to all of us all of the time. But because we're not used to it, because the ego is usually in the driving seat, it takes practice to be able to get the ego out of the driving seat and the beyond ego self, if you like, into the driving seat. And that's what the course looks at. And because the focus is very much on experiential learning, we give you practices during the courses when we're actually talking in the small groups, but also outside, and opportunities to practice what you're learning in your own work context. And so first of all, you need to get good at seeing your ego, and then making that shift, and then becoming very curious about what is this beyond ego state, what else is possible for you and for the people who you connect with in your business. So one of the ways that you get good at this is just becoming much more self-aware, and to be noticing the subtle dynamics that are going on inside of you. And I'll talk a bit more about that later on in this call. But for now, let's just do a little visualization exercise where you can just ask yourself, what's the possibilities for my relationship with my boss? So just take a moment and just ask yourself, what if I had a relationship with my boss in which I could say what I really feel? And we don't mean being able to vent your ego on your boss. We mean what you're really thinking, the ideas you have, the authentic feedback that you have. So just have a feel into that. Just see if you can connect with that beyond ego state just by sensing into that possibility. And then I'm going to ask you another couple of questions. What if I could receive what my boss wants to tell me without collapsing or defending? So that's what if my beyond ego self could hear feedback. How would that be? I just got a sense of that. And then finally, what if everyone in my work context had that kind of relationship, so that everyone is welcomed, everything they have to say is included, everything is treated just as information, not as a problem, and just have a sense into that. What if there was that natural workflow between you and your colleagues in that beyond ego state? And then this is just a thinking exercise, but just think about what would it take for you to make that shift? Because it's just a shift in perception. But what would you need to let go of in order to make that shift? Because that's probably something to do with your ego. So we've got another little experiment for you to do, which Steve's going to lead you through. And this is again, something that you can apply to your workplace straight away. So back to you, Steve.
So don't forget, you can enter questions or comments into the chat window at any time by clicking the chat icon at the bottom of the screen, and then it'll open a window at the bottom right. And only we co-hosts can see your submission. So a crucial part of choosing a beyond ego response in any given situation is knowing what to do when your ego gets triggered. We'd like to offer you a couple of tools. So another thought experiment, as Barbara said. This one might be a little less comfortable than the previous one, because I'm going to ask you to take a moment to think about a recent situation in which you got triggered. Some negative emotion reared its ugly head. For example, maybe you received challenging feedback on a project or in your performance evaluation, or maybe somebody in a meeting pointed out a mistake you made or criticized your opinion. Or maybe you're just feeling angry about being left out, being excluded from a project or a meeting. We've all had experiences like this in work context. Take a minute to bring one to mind. You might want to close your eyes if it's helpful. And remember this situation. And breathe into the feelings, as uncomfortable as they were and are when you bring them up now. I'm going to ask you to breathe into those feelings that came up, guilt maybe, or anger, or frustration, or perhaps even shame. Bring that situation to mind. Now, if you let your ego respond completely unfiltered from those challenging emotions, what would you do or say? Imagine the actual words that you'd use and the tone of your voice that would carry those words. This, of course, is your ego responding. And the next rhetorical question is, what would the consequences be? But the next question might be a little more difficult to answer. As you imagine these, as you feel the grip of this emotional egoic reaction, what do you think a beyond ego response might look like? How would it be different? Now, this is a huge question that we'll be spending much of the 9 weeks on, but let me give you a couple of possibilities for right now. I'd like to offer you 3 options to consider in that triggered moment. All these 3 options begin with you reflecting on your internal landscape, your thoughts, your feelings, your sensations, and then making a quick decision. So here's option 1. Option 1 is, I'm too emotional right now to respond at all in any helpful or effective way. The best thing I can do is simply stay silent. And by the way, research shows that despite conventional wisdom that says venting anger is really good for you, it isn't. Venting anger only focuses on the anger and exacerbates the anger. So sometimes this option 1, staying quiet, is the best thing you can do until that emotional hijacking reaction subsides. Then there's option 2. Option 2 is you having a conversation with yourself where you say, this is just my ego reacting. It's what we humans do. As I said earlier, it's human nature, it's universal, and it comes from our instinct for self-preservation or self-protection. So as powerful as this emotion feels, and as much as I want to lash out, or maybe freeze, or maybe flee, it doesn't mean anything. The emotion itself doesn't mean anything. Maybe it's best for me to just notice it, not beat myself up for having it, and decide I'm going to work with this emotion on my own, or maybe with my coach or my therapist at another time. But for now, I'm going to choose to not let it drive my behavior. That's option 2. Option 3 is very different. Option 3 says, maybe there is a beyond ego perspective accompanying the emotionally reactive response. And this beyond ego perspective does need to be voiced in order to bring an important insight to the table for this situation or these relationships. What do I mean by this? Let me give you an example. Maybe you're angry about being excluded from a meeting or a project, as I said earlier, and you see the egoic voice in that anger. Nobody appreciates me, that kind of voice. But you can also tap into a beyond ego motivation that says, for the greater good of this project, there's some anger in there that's about the greater good. I have important information and perspectives to offer here that can contribute to success. And that should be put on the table. And how you'd want to do that is in a noticing sort of way. So I notice I'm feeling angry about being excluded from this project. And I realize part of that anger is my emotional, my egoic response, but I also believe that part of it is my concern about the good of the project. And you're transparent about your response in that way. That's option 3. Now, this entire process of being at choice around your ego's voice compared with your beyond ego voice is an illustration of what we call our power principles and practices for leading beyond ego, which Rod will tell you about.
Hi, everyone. On our website, you may recall reference to our 9 principles and practices for leading beyond ego, and I'd like to speak a bit about their purpose and role in the course. If you're taking a trip and going somewhere unfamiliar, it's nice to have a map. Ken Wilber at the Integral Institute observed that if you're taking a trip in your own awareness and your own consciousness, that a map actually does help accelerate development. It helps to find a particular perspective in your own awareness and to know it with increasing depth. It really helps. And that is what these principles and practices are designed to achieve. So each principle is intended to give you direct access to an important beyond ego perspective. And when you embody that principle in your behavior, you're actually there beyond ego. It's like riding a bike. You know when you're riding a bike. It's a form of tacit knowledge or a form of experiential knowing. And as I've implied, each practice is really intended to solidify your experience with that particular beyond ego perspective, what it looks like, what it feels like. And the entire set of 9 principles are intended to be interdependent, to build on each other in a synergistic way. So I'd like to use the first principle as an example. The module topic for the first week of the course is the future of leadership. And the principle for that weekend is the power of open curiosity. And you might ask why. It's obviously because of the complex and rapidly changing world in which we live. What could be more essential than openness, curiosity to whatever is going around you and within you? And so to get a little more specific, I want to mention how open curiosity can show up in different ways. Maybe we're convinced that we already know something. Interestingly, here the challenge to be open and curious is especially important. If we have strong opinions and are not curious, we can be wrong and not even suspect that we're wrong. We can be strongly attached to our views, and cognitive bias can cement our attachment. So the best way to hold our favorite opinions is to hold them lightly. It doesn't mean that we ignore hard-won truths. It's just that we do not hold them with such certainty that we fail to look again when that's exactly what's called for. On the other hand, the situation could be exactly the opposite. We may not know something important. And in this place, open curiosity is equally valuable. According to a recent book, The Enigma of Reason, when it comes to reasoning, we humans are not very good. We have a high opinion, and as Daniel Kahneman has said, our thinking mind is lazy and biased, and this can lead to poor performance. And despite all those things, the book reported good news in several areas. And to mention one is that the best chance we have to see things accurately is when we honestly don't know, we really want to know what is true, and we have no particular agenda other than knowing what is true. And this is exactly what we mean by the power of open-minded, open-hearted, undefended curiosity. And as I'm sure many of you recognize, there are many names for what we're describing. The beginner's mind, innocent curiosity, power of not already knowing, which is the term we started with as we developed these principles. So in essence, I would say the power of open curiosity is about being emotionally available to what's right in front of us, just as it is. So what I'd like to do now is take an everyday circumstance, something that Steve has already alluded to, and that is receiving negative feedback. Do you, you can react to negative feedback as a threat. This is what ego would see. It's not curious. Or you could receive negative feedback as a gift, which is what Beyond Ego sees, which is curious and interested. Let's say you're in front of an individual or a group of people giving you feedback, and just notice in your mind the way you would feel, your thoughts, the steadiness of your eye contact, your facial expression, your tone of voice, your body language, the questions you might choose to ask them. The point here is that everything changes. The entire nature of your presence is fundamentally different. And this is something, as we all know, people can see more easily than we realize. And so it's especially important to come from the place that is feedback as a gift. So again, reacting to negative feedback as a threat, receiving negative feedback as a gift. And there's one more point, and it's about what goes on deeper inside. With negative feedback, even when you are beyond ego, you will still feel the sting of criticism. But it doesn't last, that's the thing. Maybe a moment or two. It may even be stronger, but it's quickly overcome by what you learn about yourself and how that helps you become a better leader. And you literally experience it as a gift. So this is the kind of shift in perspective and awareness that we will point to over and over. They are sometimes subtle, but substantive always. And in the course, we will give you short presentations, break up into small groups to practice amongst 3 of you, perhaps, to discuss the issue. And then we'll harvest the learnings in larger groups and offer a Q&A. And then we'll ask you to take that perspective in your daily life and to use it in your leadership context and see what happens. And then during the week, we will offer a Q&A for us to explore in depth your personal experience with this perspective. So these are the shifts in perspective that are embodied in all 9 principles, and each of them has the potential to transform your leadership. Now that I've spoken about handling negative feedback, Steve has a practical way to ask for specific feedback.
Yeah, specific feedback is the thing, and it's hard to get it in the workplace. And I love, Rod, I love your distinction between reacting on the one hand to feedback and receiving it on the other. Because one of the classic distinctions between the ego-driven workplace and the beyond ego workplace, as we're calling it, is how feedback is handled. In the egoic workplace, most of our coworkers have trouble giving us honest feedback because of some combination of their ego's response to the fear about how our ego will respond. But the beyond ego workplace demands open and honest communication as the norm, including honest, transparent feedback that might challenge the ego. You need that feedback to help you discover how to show up as a leader in the most effective ways. But how do you get that feedback when people are afraid to give it to you? I bet many of you have encountered this conundrum. We have a simple strategy to try. It's not a panacea, but it could be a significant step toward getting this honest feedback that you need. It's a sentence that starts with, it's a request that starts with the words, name one thing. So you approach your coworker or your boss. You can also do this on a personal level with your significant other or your best friend. And you say something like, name one thing that you appreciate about your working relationship with me. And you also want to ask for the other side. Name one thing that I could do differently, for example, that would help you do your work better. Now, why is this? Why are we bringing this up? Why do we consider this a significant tool? Well, when you ask someone in general for feedback, how am I doing as your boss, for example? Or how do you think I handled this meeting? Or what did you think of my presentation today? It's way too easy for your coworker to say, fine, it was great, good job. But those responses aren't very helpful. They're not specific, and they sidestep any important feedback, especially challenging feedback, which of course everybody wants to sidestep. But name one thing requests that your coworker be specific. It's hard to answer name one thing that I could do better with fine, it was great, good job. The answer doesn't fit the question. But finally, and maybe most importantly, don't forget that when you receive that honest feedback, your ego, of course, will respond, positively or negatively. Your job here is to notice if your ego gets triggered, and maybe to choose from the 3 responses that I mentioned earlier. Now, if you don't do this noticing, if you don't witness your ego's response and you respond from ego instead, you might never receive honest feedback from that coworker again. All three of us have used this word noticing at several times during the presentation today. Barbara wants to talk about the importance of noticing and how that begins to lead to a beyond ego way of being. Barbara?
Yes, well, noticing is a key skill, and it seems as if it's so obvious that you don't even need to mention that you need to notice how you're feeling, what you're picking up inside of yourself, what emotions are you feeling physically, is your jaw tight, are you noticing different sensations in your body, just noticing your inner dialogue as well, that inner critic that's constantly commentating, that voice of the ego. So one of the capacities that you need to help to develop so that you can make the shift from ego to beyond ego is this capacity to just notice. And we are living in increasingly more and more distraction-filled lives. And just taking time to check in with yourself and notice how you are, and to be aware of how somebody else is, really taking time to see what their body language is saying, to notice the resonance between you or the dissonance between you. All of these things, they just take noticing, and to be really fully present in the moment so that you can be reading the field in a more conscious way and noticing, what's my motivation? Am I connected to something that's limiting? Is it my ego driving my response here, or is it something that's beyond my ego? And so this capacity to notice all of the different pieces of information that are coming in constantly in our interactions with each other and in our increasingly distraction-filled lives, that's a particular capacity that's incredibly important. And in fact, that capacity is dependent on you being able to sit comfortably and be fully present in any moment without flinching, without wanting to move away, because the ego so wants comfort. And so in fact, there's a relationship between the ability to notice and the mindfulness and meditation practice that we also include as part of our course, because being able to meditate and to be fully present in a moment with nothing going on can help to develop your capacity to be able to notice. And so Rod is going to speak to the meditation part and why we include it in our course.
Thank you, Barbara. I think in response to what Barbara has wonderfully introduced, I'll start with the bottom line for us is that in leadership and in life, if you want to evolve your consciousness, meditation practice is absolutely essential. Why? Meditation expands how much your inner awareness can hold without reacting. It's like your capacity to tolerate ambiguity without getting upset or grasping for control. So getting more specific, meditation can create enough spaciousness around your thoughts so that you can then become more aware of your ego without reacting or pushing it away, and then the courage to set it aside as your default source of motivation. And finally, the courage to act from the wisdom you discover that's sourced from beyond ego. That's why meditation practices are increasingly taught in business schools, graduate schools, high technology, where mindfulness and meditation, for example, is widely taught. And so I'll ask you just to jump in by inviting you to engage in a brief meditation. To do this, we'll begin with the most basic and well-researched form of meditation we know of. I'll ask you to sit in a comfortable position that allows you to be both relaxed and alert. You can close your eyes or keep your eyes open, looking down maybe about 45 degrees with a soft but steady gaze on whatever is in front of you. And so I'll give you a moment to get situated. I now invite you to take a few slow, deep breaths. As you follow your breath, notice that your in-breath is quicker than your out-breath. And at the end of your in-breath, notice the quick turnaround into your slow, more easeful out-breath. During each out-breath, your brain sends strong signals to your body to relax. Your heart rate slows. Your muscles and your blood vessels relax. Your blood pressure becomes lower. And at the end of the out-breath, there's a kind of silence. A silence that persists until the next breath, and your body knows exactly when that should be. You may feel your heart beat, but otherwise, just silence. Notice that sometimes your mind tends to stop paying attention to your breath. Your thinking mind notices something else, gets interested, and off you go, thinking about that. The moment you realize that your mind is no longer paying attention to your breath, it might feel like waking up from a daydream. Don't make any problem out of it. Just return to your breath. Let go of any tendency to have expectations or to evaluate what is happening. So now continue to follow your breath, and if needed, return to your breath for another minute or so. Now I'll invite you to let go of this practice and to return to the flow of this introduction. Just to quickly reflect on our experience, I want you to know that the benefits of meditation are not linear. You can start meditating and meditate for a while and your perspective changes. You don't always know how it happened. Like a friend recently mentioned to me, you practice not judging others, or you practice not judging yourself in meditation. And later you notice you're not judging others. During this course, we'll give you a simple practice instruction of this sort, and each week add additional insight into the practice to deepen your practice. The time commit we'll ask for is about 5 minutes, 2 or 3 times a day, in the morning on awakening or at a convenient time during the day. And as you become more comfortable and practiced, You can choose particular times before or after a challenging meeting, or when you've had a strong emotional charge. That is a particularly valuable time. So this is something you can practice and experiment with at work and at home, today, tonight, tomorrow, really everywhere. If you already have a meditation practice, we encourage you to continue that, but try this shorter method from time to time when it seems appropriate. Now, Barbara, for a wrap-up or overview.
Yes. Thanks. I was just going to add in a few other elements just so that you have an idea about what we'll be covering each week. So besides the meditation part, we also offer you a power principle, like Rod went through one of the practice power principles, that will be like a theme for each week, and a practice assignment, so something that you can apply to your daily life. And also we have an online forum, and where there's a discussion and opportunity to engage with other students as well. And every week there's a 2-hour session, a module where we'll have time for us to talk to you as we are now, times for us to break you out into small groups so that you can do some dialogue and some experiential learning, and do some exercises that we're going to give you that can help to develop your awareness of your ego, to develop your awareness of the beyond ego state, and also how to make that shift between the two. And also we're going to give you the opportunity to to engage with each other, and also to do a Q&A. So we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A during the module when on in each of the 9 weeks, but also we'll have a separate 90-minute live Q&A in between the sessions as well. So there's lots of opportunity for us to engage with you, and they'll be a bit more like coaching sessions, so that we can really help you to apply what you're learning in your day-to-day life and in your leadership role. So what can you expect to get out of the course? Well, hopefully the beginning of a lifelong adventure, something that these principles and practices, something that you're going to keep using for the whole of the rest of your life in your whatever capacity you serve others in. And that because they're capacities that always keep revealing more and more the more you live and work with them, the more riches you'll get, the more you apply. So it's that we really do feel that what we're offering is something that's going to be that's going to support you as you go forward in your life always. And really, because there are multiple challenges for our time, especially in leadership, there's so much that's needed from us to respond to the needs of the world, that we think the shift from ego to beyond ego is the key. And it's the one practice and principle that precedes all other leadership practices and principles. And so we really invite you to participate in our course. And Steve is just going to give you a little bit more information about the logistics.
Well, I think where I'd like to go now is to Q&A. So we've laid everything out for you. I want to emphasize that this session, this intro session, is very different from what we'll be doing in the course, format-wise or structure-wise, because as Barbara mentioned, it's going to be highly interactive in the course sessions. In this intro session, we made a conscious decision not to be interactive because we didn't want to put pressure on people on those of you who are watching or listening who have not yet made a commitment to the course. We didn't want to put pressure on you to be interactive, to interact with each other. If you decide to commit to the course, then I won't say we'll put pressure on you, but that is the expectation, because you won't learn anywhere near as much just by listening to us talk than you will by deeply diving into, in terms of having open and honest conversations with each other and applying these principles in between sessions to your work context, and then coming back and reporting on how that went, that sort of thing. That's how people really learn and grow. So be prepared for not a teaching, lecturing experience, but a highly interactive experience. And with that, let me just let us open up to whatever questions you have. We've got 5 minutes left in the hour that we had advertised for this call, but we're happy to stay on for as long as we need to answer your questions. So let's see what we have. We have a question that says, will we receive PDF handouts as the course progresses? Let's see, we're using an online learning portal called Ruzuku, which is a highly respected portal. We'll be sending you emails every week, right after the course sessions, and then again before the next course session, keeping you apprised of the between session assignments, the links to the recordings for all the sessions, and everything will be, everything you need to know will be in the online learning portal. PDFs you can download. I'm not sure if you can download them to a PDF format, but I'm sure you can download information from the Ruzuku platform. And it is our intention to give you all the information that you need in order to maximize the quality of your experience in the course. Let's see, other questions. What if I can't make a session? Barbara, Rod, you want to tackle that one? Rod, I think you're on.
Okay. We encourage you to do that, to attend, but if you can't, you could come to the session, the question and answer session, if any questions arise from your listening to the recording, or you can find a friend to engage in conversations that reflect the exercises that we have in mind. And so these are ways you can listen, understand as a reflection what is being discussed by the group, and maybe have a conversation with a colleague.
And also, if anybody else wants to ask a question, if you just use the chat box, if you go down to the bottom of the screen and press on, it might be on more, but then you can just press on chat and then type in a question if there's any. Is there a way for people to raise their hand, Steve? I don't see it.
Not in this particular format.
Okay. Okay. So just
I want to briefly add to what Rod said. As a coach, as a certified coach, I'm kind of a fierce believer in engagement, in real-time engagement, interaction, the synergy of conversation. So I think among the three of us, maybe I'm a little more fierce about this notion of it's really great if you can show up in real time. On the other hand, if you can gather a cohort together, even another person, one other person, or maybe two, you can listen to the recordings as a group, and you can do the dialogues that we're prompting in the recordings and really not miss anything. So that's a possibility. Another question we have, a big challenge is how to engage to move into leadership from where I'm at now. Will you be addressing this at all? And I think the answer to that is yes, powerfully, but indirectly. Because again, we define a leader as anyone who has any influence on any other human being. So if you're optimizing the quality of your influence by coming from a beyond ego place more consistently, then indirectly, but I believe powerfully, that will lead you into opportunities for people to notice your expanded leadership capacities, and then, as the questioner says, move into leadership. Anyone, Barbara, Rod, anything else you want to add to that question?
I think you have it.
Okay,
Barbara,
I think you're on mute. Looks like you're listening.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions on the chat, so I think we're done. But if you do have any other questions after this call, then you can just email us at support@leadingbeyondego.com, and we'll do our best to answer your question there.
So thanks everybody for your time. We really appreciate your taking part of your Sunday morning or afternoon, whatever that is for you, with us. Just want to emphasize that the early bird pricing, which is $379, which is considerably less than most of these kinds of 9-week or similar offerings charge, because it is a pilot program. We're likely to make mistakes. We want your feedback. So we're offering a discounted rate, $379. That early bird pricing ends in 12 days on March 30th. And we really hope you'll join us. We look forward to supporting you and challenging you on your leadership, your Beyond Ego leadership journey. And we hope that you will join us and people from across the globe in this new adventure, exploring, as Barbara has said and I said earlier, the leadership capacity that we believe precedes and facilitates all others. Thanks, everybody.
Brilliant.
Take good care.
Thanks for coming.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.